Welcome, everyone. I'm Amy Seeley, president of Seeley Test Pros and LEAP, helping students to succeed in all kinds of tests from 8th grade to grad school throughout Ohio.
And I'm Mike Bergen, president of Chariot Learning, helping students with Test School and Life based out of Rochester, New York.
Between the two of us today, we have over 60 years of experience at the highest levels of the test preparation and supplemental education industries.
We both love to talk and learn about the latest issues in education, testing, and admissions. So let's get down to tests and the rest. The fascinating topic we want to explore today is post-pandemic learning loss. But first, let's meet our special guest, Nancy Weinstein.
Nancy Weinstein has an MBA from Harvard Business School and a BS/BSc summa cum laude from the University of Pennsylvania and Wharton School of Management and Technology program, Bioengineering and Finance. Nancy founded Mindprint Learning with the perspectives of both a parent and an innovator. Realizing a need to address a common challenge for parents and educators, she drew upon her background in science and business to create Mindprint, the first ever valid at-home cognitive assessment supported with next step strategies for growth. As a mother of two, Nancy recognizes the challenges parents face today, from helping with homework to navigating the ever-changing pace of education and technology. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Nancy, we are so happy to have you back. It has been a long time since you've been on the show. You appeared back in episode 132 to discuss the science of memory. I'm sure a lot has happened with you since then. So before we dive into our fascinating topic, we'd love to hear what you've been up to.
Well, there was a pandemic, I think, in there since then. Other than that, my two daughters, you talked about, I have two children. My two daughters are both in college, so I am an empty nester. That's on the personal side. And then on the business side, Mindprint has been growing. We work with tutoring companies, public schools, private schools, and hoping that we're helping kids all over the world learn how to learn.
That's fantastic. Not just the empty nest experience, which I'm going through as well, but also that Mindprint is growing. For listeners who are unacquainted with your exceptional resource, can you tell us a bit about Mindprint?
Sure. We are a platform that enables you to, in about an hour, understand your child's learning strengths and needs. So it's 9 puzzle-like tasks. You can do it at home. You can do it in school on the computer. And we tell you how you learn in complex reasoning, memory, those executive functions that we hear lots about, and how efficiently you work, and use that to support all aspects of learning in and out of school.
Nancy, how young can students be to take a Mindprint?
We start at age 8 and we go all the way through college. So sometimes students kind of hit that wall in college. They were strong students in high school, but all of a sudden the independence and flexibility in college, and sometimes just for the first time, school is challenging for some of our most gifted students. And so we work with them as well. So all ages.
Fantastic. Now, we know that you and your team are students of cognitive psychology, and it really comes as no surprise that you've been tracking concepts in what's happened to learners since the pandemic. As a matter of fact, member of your team, Dr. Nancy Tsai, released a white paper, Post-Pandemic Brain Changes, results from 35,000 students. So I guess we should start just by asking, has there really been what they call post-pandemic learning loss?
So we probably wouldn't be here if there weren't, right?
It's a little bit of a softball
Mike's
question.
a naysayer. No.
Leading.
And I just want to be clear, Nancy Tsai does not work directly for us. She's an independent researcher at MIT and at Harvard, and we contracted with her to look at the data and draw some analyses. So, but to answer your real question, Mike, so we know from looking at standardized achievement scores that there clearly is learning loss, meaning that a 6th grader's reading comprehension now is on average is lower than a 6th grader was 5 or 6 years ago. And we know that math scores are even worse than reading scores. And we know that younger children scores have dropped more so than older students' scores. So that's the achievement side of the equation that has been, I think, broadly reported on, and not just in the US, around the world. And what we were endeavoring to do at Mindprint is to say, why? Right? Why are the scores lower? Is it that students aren't trying? Is it that they are distracted by social media? Is it that they just missed some of their learning and never made it up? Why? But that was the genesis for our research.
Fantastic. Take us through the journey. What did you discover, and did you actually pull out any reasons for why?
So what we did was we had data, because we look at students across grade levels, across income levels, across capability levels. We worked from, with students who are gifted to students who are struggling learners in school as part of our business in working with schools. And so when we were seeing all this, all the media coverage about learning loss, we said, wait a second, we have all this data on students' cognitive skills before there was a pandemic, across grade levels and ages, and income levels. And now we have all this additional data since the pandemic. Maybe it's not all the engagement pieces that people talk about, or the executive functions. People say students can't focus with social media coming out of the pandemic. Maybe their brains have changed. And so we took all of the data on these 35,000 students and said, are there actual differences? Meaning, does the average student have weaker complex reasoning skills now than they did before the pandemic, or memory skills? Because we know that environment has an impact on the brain, stress has an impact on the brain, experience has an impact on the brain. Did it actually change? And the answer was yes, it changed. And what was the most interesting was it didn't change the way everyone thought it would. So when we poll teachers or educators or even parents and say, what do you think changed the most? How are students really different? If a skill changed, what changed? And almost everyone says attention. Kids can't focus the way they did before the pandemic. And actually what we found was that attention was the only skill that went up slightly.
Interesting.
Surprise. Really interesting.
Yeah.
But what we found, what fell the most, was verbal.
Can I guess?
Oh,
I was going to say retention.
yes. Yes.
Yay!
Yes.
Ding, 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 ding. Thank you for letting me play. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay.
Really, really interesting. So we measure two types of memory. We measure verbal. Do you remember words, what you read, what you heard? And visual. Do you remember pictures? And so we measure 10 skills. Those were the two that fell the most. And verbal memory fell a lot more than visual memory. Really interesting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Do your findings persist across gender or age cohorts?
So really interesting was that every age level we looked at, memory did drop, verbal more than visual. So the trends were consistent across age levels. But what we found was that the younger students had the greatest drops.
And I wonder if that's more because of like the formative, like in a formative stage, maybe that would be the reason why.
I think Amy maybe read our research paper before she came
really?
on your team. She's getting all the answers right.
No, actually, I didn't realize this was a quiz that I was actually maybe going to win today. Maybe then Mike and I should have played together. But no, well, it's confirming everything that I have seen with our high school students, Mike. But also, Nancy, I actually am also the mother of a 9-year-old. So I'm observing all of this like right in my backyard. So there you go.
It's so interesting. So I think you're right. It is because it's formative. So when we look at cognitive skills and how they develop over time, memory is the first domain to really plateau, meaning that by the time you're 10 or 11, your memory is almost fully developed. And so the thinking is that our older students, their memory was fully developed. They weren't using it, so there was a little bit of loss, but then we get them back in the classroom and now they can come back.
Like kind of whipped back, like whipping them back into shape almost, right?
But our younger students, it never developed. And it didn't develop at the same rate and in the same quote unquote normal development, typical development, being in school, then and having to remember what you did in school for a little bit of homework and then coming back and repeating it the next day. All of that sort of normal cadence students didn't get. And so the sense is that might have been the reason for it. What's interesting is that the question might be, well, why did verbal memory fall more than visual? Amy, you want to take a guess? I'll let Mike guess too, but you've been doing such a good job guessing. I'm
going to guess that there was less reading or encountering of text, but I don't know.
Mike, you want to try? I think we don't know. The short answer is we don't
know.
Well, you're saying that verbal memory went down more than visual.
Correct.
Yeah, because during the pandemic, everyone kind of retreated to their corners and engaged with their devices, and there wasn't as much kind of verbal communication with a wide variety of people. Everyone was in their little cohort and maybe not talking to a lot of different people.
Yeah, and I think that is the thinking, right? Is that's what happened. That's why visual memory kids were still on TikTok and Instagram and remembering those pictures and images. I mean, that's almost a game of memory, remembering where the picture was, what you saw, finding it again. And so that there was still developmental practice there, whereas with verbal memory, they weren't reading as much. They weren't being quizzed as much. They weren't having the same spelling tests and vocabulary quizzes. And I had high schoolers during the pandemic. I don't think they had one closed book test during the pandemic.
Right.
Everything was open book, open note.
I would imagine, I mean, to be good at memory, one must practice it. And when we're practicing it, we're creating study skills, we're creating memory habits that serve us. And so when we don't test kids on retention, right? Open book tests wouldn't do that. You don't get better at something if you're not practicing it. Would that be a fair assessment, Nancy?
I think that's a great way to look at it. And so then the natural next question would be, well, will it come back? And the assumption, we don't know, we're going to keep testing it and measuring and seeing if it changes. The assumption is yes, in the right environment, giving students enough practice, yes, it will. If, however, schools say, well, they can't remember it, so we're not going to ask them to remember it, we're going to make everything open book, open note, then it might not develop, right? You could see that there's a default to that. Well, if I ask them to remember it, they're not going to remember it anyway, and so therefore we won't. And my response to that is, then I hope nobody in that generation becomes my doctor, because that's really scary.
I can relate to that. Yeah.
Aren't we too far from the problem to engage in immediate remediation? I mean, I definitely want to get into what students can do and what educators can do, but wasn't the time to rectify that issue at the point like right after it happened, right after schools opened? And I wanted to ask about, was this geographically restricted or is this across the board? Because in some places, students were in school a lot earlier than others.
All good questions. So we always know in everything that we do, in every facet of life, early intervention is almost always better. So ideally, yes, we would have known this and rectified it, but we'll also go with it's never too late.
That's fair. That's
right?
fair.
It is never too late. So we would say it's not too late. Students were, to answer your question, we are seeing differences by grade level, suggesting that what you did during the pandemic did have an impact on your skills.
Okay, so I was just going to ask, and this might be a part of what you're going to say. I was wondering if you guys have any sort of data on, a lot of people will say, well, in COVID, we were not online or we were online. Do you have any way of determining for those students that were online versus not online, if that made a difference, or in the aggregate, it's just everybody was impacted?
Honestly, we can't tell. And
that's what I figured.
We say every student is different. Students started at different levels coming into the pandemic, and then where they end up would also change, right? We always say you had students with a near photographic memory before the pandemic. You still have students with a near photographic memory, but the average has changed, which means if you're a teacher or a tutor, what your expectation is for your students coming in, that might need to change what they're coming in, not what you want to set the goal to be, but your expectation for their starting point, that might need to change.
But that's interesting because, so for example, in my company, obviously we do a lot of SAT, ACT prep. So that's high schoolers, juniors, seniors. But we also work with eighth graders in anticipation of high school admissions. And that's the population that I've been observing over the last couple of years, the real problem with, because this issue of memory, as we're talking, it's like they look at you like, well, how was I supposed to memorize that? Or how was I supposed to remember it? Or they just assume because they've seen it one time and you're like, no, that's not going to be how this works. So it's really I feel like you're telling Mike and me is like, get prepared, because this population, these younger people will be around. And I still remember, because my daughter was in kindergarten in 2020. She entered kindergarten in the fall of 2020. And I still remember thinking to myself, well, we won't hear about COVID after 2033 because she's going to graduate from high school in 2033. So, but what you're saying is like this reverberation, it's going to be around for a long time, and we need to figure out what we can do about it. So I'm curious, what kinds of things can we do to repair these sort of pandemic learning gaps? And is it going to look different for different ages at this point in time?
Yes. So let's just say, this is what I would say is the good news. So there is a good news side of the story, and I think it's really important, which is when we looked at all the skills that changed, our concern was going to be, did complex reasoning change? So in other words, if you're teaching if you taught an algebra lesson before the pandemic, and then you gave the same kind of group of students that same lesson before the pandemic, they understood it, and after the pandemic, they look at you like you have three heads. Is that the problem? Is that what we're going to find? And the answer was no. We found that students can learn and are capable of understanding in much the same way. That's really good news, because it's really hard to try and, it's hard to teach stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard, right? It's hard to teach algebra. And if we have to change all of our algebra lessons, that's really hard.
Yeah.
The good news piece of it is that memory is the most readily addressable. So the learning scientists know more about memory than they do about any other domain. And the other part of it is we know the answer is practice, right? Is more practice. Even if you have a weak memory, if you practice in the right way, you will develop that memory and you will learn the information. And so what we think is most important, and which is why I appreciate you having me on your podcast, is that we want teachers and parents to know that the rule of thumb that we typically use around retention has changed. And if they know that the rules change, they can do something about it. So what I mean by that is typical rule of thumb when we ask classroom teachers, they will say, I need to say something in 5 to 7 different ways for it to stick with most of my students. Ideally, you show a picture, you also speak it, you have them write it down, but at least 5 to 7 times, no matter what, in order for it to stick. And then I know it's going to be there. Well, based on the data that we're seeing, that rule of thumb should now be closer to, I don't know, 12 to 15.
Oh my God. Because I always said the rule of 6, like you got to hear something 6 times to make it stick. So now you're saying it's like double that.
The rule of 12.
The
so
rule
what
of
you're
12.
saying is that retrieval practice and the testing effect and all of these concepts that we understand to help drive retention and retrieval are still effective, but we need more of it than ever.
More reps. You need more reps, Mike.
More reps. It's more reps.
Mm-hmm.
And we always had students who could cram the night before and still do well. We still have those students, but they're far fewer.
There are fewer of them.
There are fewer of them, which means they need to learn how to study. And okay, here's the kicker. Guess when you're educators, when do students really learn study skills?
Well, usually I would have said they should be learning them by like 7th grade, really, truly, to me. Like when you hit that 7th grade year, certainly before you get to high school, for sure.
Right. And guess what? That was during the pandemic. And we know nobody was being taught study skills during, I shouldn't say nobody, but.
Well, you teach what you think you can do. And I think a lot of teachers had to cut things, even if that was a part of what they would normally do. That would have probably been one of the first things you would have cut, right?
Exactly. So not only do we now have these weaker study skills or memory skills, but students didn't learn the practices and techniques. And so now, right, so now they had a double whammy. And if you're a high school teacher, you're like, oh, they should know how to do that. We forget that they never learned just the basic techniques. Like even someone saying to them, rereading your notes is not going to make it stick. Mm-hmm. Right? You had, what did Mike said, retrieval practice, the testing effect, all those things like testing and quizzing yourself, using flashcards. That's what you learn in middle school. Like those are really core. We depend on our middle school teachers to teach students that. And it very likely didn't happen in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Anecdotally, I encounter lots of students that still don't even understand that concept of creating flashcards and using them.
No, I had a student recently who literally, she said she could not figure out how to do it. Now you have to understand, I sent her what I think is a really great YouTube video that I send to students on how to create effective study, like flashcards. She even said after watching the video, she still could not make them on her own. Now, that was like mind blown because like you can't even watch a video and figure that out. But it's also interesting because prior to COVID, like literally in January of 2020, I was thinking about trying to launch a full-on study skills program at my company. And then COVID hits, whatever. And the irony is what you're saying to me is, boy, if parents would have embraced that program, they might actually be in a better place. Their students might be in a better place today. But that's actually, I mean, it's good to know that that's actually some skills that we need to start thinking about even building into our test prep programs. Is part of it should just be, what are good study skills?
Absolutely. And we all benefit from learning them. So, and we do make our study skills free on our website. I know, but like, so that you can, because they're evidence-based strategies, they're all we know the same strategies. We just need someone to convince the students to use them. And I would say you're both tutors, you know what it takes to convince a kid to do something. There are kids that are compliant, they'll do anything you ask them to do. There are kids that are less compliant and won't. But what always gets kids to do stuff is success. If they are successful in trying a strategy, they will continue to use that strategy if they have success. And if they don't have success, it's hard to get them to keep trying it.
The buy-in. It's basically you need buy-in.
You need buy-in for adults too. There is one other skill that went down across the board. Can I tell you about that? Is it okay if
Please.
a conversation?
Yes.
A little bit? You want to guess which one it is? Amy? Amy looks like she wants to guess.
Too, but I'm like, okay, wow. The memory thing was the biggest thing. This is my big takeaway today. Other skill.
And you might not know all the skills that we tested.
I don't. So that might be why,
question.
Right?
Not a fair question. So flexible thinking. Probably not too surprising. So the ability, when we say flexible thinking, what we mean by that is your ability to take corrective feedback and adapt your approach.
Right. And there was not a lot of that during the period where students were at home. They were allowed to log into classes without video or audio. There wasn't a lot of back and forth with their teachers, and we don't know what was happening at home.
And we don't know what was happening at home. So flexible thinking went down across the board, including, so part of our program is we also have teachers and tutors take our assessment as well, so that they know how they learn, because we're all lifelong learners, right? So and sometimes we don't know how we learn best, and it's interesting to find out, or at least to confirm it. And so we saw that was the skill that declined the most for teachers.
Interesting. So the impact of teachers, right? So their flexible thinking did not advance. That's interesting.
And that's a whole other topic to explore. What happened with the educators themselves?
Well, and I want to be clear, we test teachers because that's who we work with. We would hypothesize that if we tested all adults, we would see the same thing.
Similar trend.
But we only have our teacher data. But when we talk about the crisis in teaching with the high teacher attrition, we can understand why it's frustrating for teachers if they have students who feels like they're not listening to them. And then you have the teacher, him or herself, who feels less,
the efficacy of their work. They're not getting the impact. They're not getting the result.
What it sounds like you're trying to say, Nancy, is they're not as skilled. They're not themselves able to execute at the level that their profession historically has demanded.
Yeah. And they're not, so if kids changed a lot, they're less equipped to deal with those changes.
Yeah.
Than they would have been before the pandemic.
Well, I can imagine if you are an older teacher, right? Which we know, I mean, the end of so much has changed in education. If you've been in education for 20, 25, 30 years at this point, that would explain even like people wanting to get out of the profession, because it's like, I can't even would be what I could hear them saying. I can't even. And I see that myself, though. There's a frustration of like, oh, why am I not connecting with these kids? Because I always have, right? That's very, very interesting. Yeah.
Well, this is a fascinating topic. I have a feeling we could talk about this for hours. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Nancy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
If listeners would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
They can connect with us at mindprintlearning.com or email me directly, Nancy@mindprintlearning.com. I'm always happy to talk to anybody who wants to talk about cognitive neuroscience. It's my passion.
Awesome. We hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. Be sure to join us for another fascinating topic and guest on the next Test and the Rest.
Did you enjoy this episode as much as we did? Find expanded links and more for this and all of our episodes at our show page at testsandtherest.com. While you're there, be sure to explore everything the larger TestBright site has to offer, including real, expert, unbiased answers to the toughest admissions testing questions. Of course, we'd love for you to rate, review, and subscribe to Test and the Rest on your favorite podcast platform. If there's a topic or guest you'd like us to feature, just let us know and spread the word.